Sean and I are going to do a double act. I'm Carole Goble from the University of Manchester in the UK. I'm joint head of node of Elixir UK, which is the European Research Infrastructure for Life Science Data UK division. And as part of that, I'm part of a big team that has 250 organizations across Europe who are coordinating data management and data analysis in the life sciences. And we use workflows big time. So I also lead the workflow registry called Workflow Hub, the RO Create activity that's led by Stian Solones, which is all to do with packaging workflows and workflow provenance. We heard about it a little yesterday and so on. So I'm very much in the workflow delivery world in the life sciences. Sean?
I'm Sean Wilkinson. I work in the Workflow and Ecosystem Services group at Oak Ridge National Lab. And I mean, having to follow Carole Goble is a little hard to, I don't have I don't have that much to list, obviously. But my background is in bioinformatics and high performance computing, and I co-chair a working group with Carole on FAIR workflows. So anyway, next slide. So background for those who maybe were living under a rock. The FAIR principles have been around now for 10 years. They first were sort of thought of in 2014, first published in 2016, and they're mostly associated in people's minds with data. And here, obviously, you can read what's here, but FAIR spells findable, accessible, interoperable, and reusable. They all center around metadata. Findability is about persistent identifiers, rich metadata, indexing, registering, because the things need to be findable for both humans and computers. The FAIR principles are interesting in the sense that they are designed to help computers and to manipulate digital objects, and those same methods that help computers do it also help humans do it. So that's why then for accessibility, we always talk about this anyway, and everything else for clear access protocols, being able to access metadata even if the data is missing. For interoperability, this is everyone's favorite. It is, no fun at all. But using standards to make data that works with applications, other workflows, analysis, storage, processing, that sort of thing. Reusability is the final letter, because the goal of FAIR is to optimize data reuse. Reuse itself is, in this case, sort of about metadata standards, data usage, licensing, and provenance. So next slide, please. The biggest things that have changed since the last summit has actually changed quite a lot. This was a topic at the last summit, and the main challenges that we listed in the final report was that the FAIR principles for computational workflows need to be nailed down. We need to actually figure out what they really are, and are they separate from data and other things that have come before it. We also said that we need metrics to measure the fairness of workflows, and we mentioned that we need to provide guidance for principles, policies, and best practices for people doing workflows. To update that, it's actually sort of a success story for the Workflows Community Initiative itself. We created a working group, and that group has worked since April 2023 to create a draft of the FAIR principles applied to workflows, and we'll talk about those in just a second. As far as the metrics for measuring the fairness of a workflow, it's always tricky anyway to measure fairness. FAIR is very vague, and it's supposed to be guidelines instead of rules, and you don't want to shame people. You're trying to encourage people to do these things. Additionally, there are competing visions for exactly what a really fair data set looks like. There's not a ton for workflows yet because we had to nail down the principles first. And then the updates for principles, policies, and best practices is still a challenge because FAIR itself delegates to the communities to implement what is correct for their community standards. And workflows are done by more than just the workflow community. So that makes it tricky for us to provide that, but we're working on that. So next slide, please. There. So also since 2022, this is much different. FAIR has been applied at many levels of the ecosystem. As I mentioned, the scientific data, it was first formulated in 2014, but not published till 2016. Research software, first publication was in 2020 and then was published in 2022. For open hardware, not hardware itself, but for open hardware, these same principles about assigning persistent identifiers, assigning licenses and interoperable standards for releasing schematics, that sort of thing, is an ongoing project with its own working group elsewhere. AI and machine learning was published last year as well for how do you apply the FAIR principles to models. Earlier this year, a report came out from a workshop last year in which people were contemplating how to apply FAIR principles to facilities and instruments in the sense of assigning persistent identifiers to like a microscope or something, ways also to help generate, to keep track of credit for people whose jobs is to calibrate microscopes, take care of that sort of thing. Like how we assign credit depends on how we record metadata and build systems on top of that. And then finally, computational workflows, which I've highlighted at the bottom, that's us. That's the working group I had mentioned a second ago. And we are any minute going to release this report. I promise it's coming. So next slide, please. So the workflow group or the working group itself, it has a lot of names in here. If your name has been left out, please come to the breakout session and heckle me. But we meet twice a month, and each meeting is held in 2 time zones, actually. For the Atlantic side, for Europe and America, and then we hold one also to try to not just try to include Australia, but because there's very valuable contributions. It's been huge that we've had both of these. This has really been helpful. We've got stuck in various rabbit holes and loops over the year, especially what is a workflow. When we were trying to apply the principles to workflows, we decided it was important to define a workflow, and that was pretty much of a nightmare for anyone who's ever had that conversation. And we were trying to decide if we needed new principles and that sort of thing. We've pretty much arrived at providing customized guidance for applying the FAIR principles to workflows by treating workflows as both data and software. The draft itself is very close. It's linked here. We're at the tweaking stage. It will be out very soon. And the value of that report is mainly in the argumentation. So next slide, please. So I promise I'm not going to read the whole table to you. I just want you to see if this is the only exposure you have to FAIR and to FAIR workflows, just to see this real quick. Findability for workflows, because this is straight out of the draft, is that a workflow and its associated metadata are easy for both humans and machines to find. This is not just making it available on Google. You have to ask yourself how Google is finding and indexing and registering things. And that's the point of this. So next slide. Accessibility, same kind of thing. Workflow and its metadata are retrievable via standardized protocols. It's important. It's something we usually think about taking for granted, even for open science, but FAIR principles are not strictly about open science. They adapt for different communities, and they entail science that is done less openly. For example, national security concerns can still have FAIR for what is fair in their community. And so although these kind of things seem very obvious as standardized protocols, for those of us who work in open science, it's still necessary. So next slide, please. So for interoperability, like I said, everyone's favorite, it's so weird. Workflow interoperates with other workflows. The workflow components need to interoperate. And how they do that will be by exchanging data and or metadata through interaction via APIs described by standards. When you see over in the far column, what those mean is these are the principles we have sort of inherited from the FAIR principles that were laid out for software and for data. And you can see in the bottom right corner, there's a real weird one that comes out of, well, there's several that come out of I and R. The FAIR principles have a little bit of overlap in certain ways. But the important part here is that workflows and their components need to interoperate. So next slide. And this is the final part, reusability. So the workflow needs to be both usable and reusable. And in English, those mean pretty similar things, but in our case, it's slightly different. Usability, we mean that it can be executed, and reusability is more of like almost like a should be executed. Like, does it meet standards of the community? Can it be understood, modified, built upon? This involves licensing also, and being able to tell where the workflow came from and its components where they came from. So next slide.
Yeah, thank you. So some of the challenges that we came across when we were discussing that still are challenges are when we get into the area of what is a workflow component and the notion of composability. What are the components? We went in a bit of a tailspin quite a long time about what is a workflow that I know Thomas will thoroughly enjoy discussing. For example, but the issues here are to do with fragments and sub-workflows that are also subcomponents that you end up with FAIR all the way down. So you get turtles all the way down. So how do we handle that kind of notion? We have quite different workflow communities and modalities. So we have facility-tuned HPC simulation type workflows versus the distributed bioinformatic tool pipelines that were mentioned with the Galaxy project just a few moments ago. So it's a broad church, and there are hundreds of languages. So how does that affect the fairness activity that we were undertaking? And we observed that the workflows typically have a declarative aspect, so they have data associated with them. They have languages associated with them that have a declarative description of the execution, as well as execution aspects. So as you saw earlier, we took FAIR principles from data as well as FAIR principles from software and tried to mix them all up. Next slide. But we have a whole bunch more challenges that came up in the discussions, which is around FAIR++. So portability is not part of FAIR. Quality is certainly not part of FAIR. You can have a FAIR workflow or FAIR piece of data that is of poor quality, but it's still FAIR. You can have very good data and very good workflows that aren't FAIR. Reproducibility is not the same as reusability. Sustainability of the whole approach of FAIR services and FAIR metadata around those workflows. And are the workflows themselves sustainable? So are they persistent? That's another aspect that's important for reusability. But maybe reusability isn't feasible in all times because you can't get access to the compute environment. That may be a very strong issue in the HPC world. And then transparency, the whole notion of openness, because FAIR is not the same as open. The A stands for accessible, not O for open. And also there's a question about how do people actually find, compare, and search rank workflows? Do they find workflows by structure? There has been work in this past around that. It's quite old work. So it's not really understood how people actually find workflows in a useful kind of way. Next slide. Some potential solutions. So there's this very nice paper here, 10 Simple Rules for Building FAIR Workflows. So folks are going ahead and doing this, and we have lots of infrastructure that supports the FAIR workflow world. For example, DocStore and Workflow Hub for being able to register the metadata around workflows in order to be able to find them and share them. Mechanisms of being able to describe the workflows with rich metadata, various different interoperability efforts in certain workflow management systems like Galaxy, which is one of the leaders in this world for adopting some of those standards, testing environments to check that you can still access and use those workflows and so on. So there is quite a lot of work in the community in an ecosystem of FAIR enabling services to support workflows. And so our topics for discussion are tweaking the draft and getting out there, because we've been working on this for a while. But then how would we get these FAIR principles into practice? What would we need to do? What steps would we need to take as WCI, but also as a community in general? What can tools and services can we develop? What tools and services already exist that can encourage FAIR practices? And I think that relates also to the UI discussion that was preceded us, because I think that's very important. How do we embed FAIR automatically into the interfaces when you're building workflows? What is a FAIR workflow component? How could FAIR Plus enable a future where machines can program the workflows? So can we use AI technology in order to be able to program workflows to produce the metadata associated with workflows? And should we extend those FAIR principles to include all the ones that we missed out, like portability and reusability? reproducibility. So we've got quite a lot of discussions, and I think they cross-cut some of the discussion points in the other two sessions as well.